Hello, everyone. My name is Judith Resnick.
Hello, everyone. My name is Judith Resnick. Hello, everyone.
And I'm hearing myself. I teach law at Yale Law School, and I am the current chair for another little bit of the Law and Humanities section. And on behalf of my section and the ALS section on minority groups and the section on criminal justice, I'm very glad to welcome you to a poignant conversation called Encountering the State's Punitive Power, Seeing, Building, Reading, and Understanding the Impact of the Carceral State. It's extreme. I feel incredibly grateful to be sharing this work with the people who you'll be hearing from this afternoon, and to work with so many of you. And we are all part of a large group of people. We all saw a state of siege at the Capitol, and we all saw that for some people that was a new experience. And we know for many of the people we know, work with, live with, that actually states of siege are how they live their life all the time. And many people have to duck regularly to try to stay safe, both from non-state power and from state power. So the violence that is around us is something we are addressing. And this program, in which each of us will talk and show some imagery for about 15 minutes with hopes for times for some forms of exchange in this format, is what we're doing. There's a way that all of you can enter your names into the chat publicly. And we know that we're speaking to lots of people. And I'm personally regret that these are not all Zoom meeting format, because we could at least see your phone numbers, if not your faces. But now we can only know that you're there, but we're trying to find a way to be in conversation with you. So if you start by entering your names, you can all, quote, see each other in some way, and we'll find a way, we hope, to talk with and among ourselves. And that this, of course, is one iteration of a long conversation that we're in. And with that, if I'm lucky and I can actually take the next slide. Okay. So one way I wanted to begin was to remind people that prison was once seen as the great reform, because from branding, execution, transportation to the colonies in the English Empire and other empires, the idea was that prison was a good way forward. It was a progressive response. And on the progressive response, the sort of famous speakers in the US European tradition of Beccaria in Italy and Jeremy Bentham in England and John Howard, seeing the destruction, all of prisons and the filth, all became committed to forms of proportionate, to start developing the idea that punishment shouldn't be aimless but purposeful. And on the purposeful side should be proportionate in some way, and either in the name of redemption of souls or in the name of utility. They all had theories of punishment and ideas about the state, but no glory here, because if you read them, the descriptions that they propose for the forms of punishment are nauseatingly aggressive. And the goal, and by the way, and sorry, Foucault has it not quite right, Bentham really wanted people to see this as a deterrent. So he would let everybody come in and inspect. He was an equal opportunity surveillant in the sense of wanting people to see the degradation of punishment as a way to deter criminals. And he had lots of details of the kinds and forms. So this picture here is starting to put on the screen that the minute there is prison as the reform, everybody understands prison needs to be reformed, and societies grow up all over the Europe and the United States. And here's the poor prisoner in a saint-like version. It's an English artist drawing of the Bastille in France. So apropos Brexit, the English are saying, look at those horrible prisons, when they could very well say, look at their own horrible prisons along the way. This purse is sort of the prisoner as a sympathetic object of concern comes on the screen, as does efforts to revamp prisons and organize them. And the profession of corrections begins. This is very incipient here, but here's just a drawing of how to create a larger, this is our front end of enormous prison growth. And if we move here, this is the Men's House of Correction in Amsterdam. in the 1780s, Amsterdam was worried about its declining population, and this is a portfolio of about 100 prints to show you the glories of Amsterdam. A fifth of those prints are devoted to containing people, because containing vagrants and poor people and criminals is why you would think Amsterdam's a good, clean place. And here's the largest building built in the 1780s in Amsterdam, the Men's House of Correction. And when you come inside, you'll see that this is the portfolio of advertising prints. This isn't me bringing something that isn't on view. Casually, people are observing a man being flogged for failing to work hard enough, and you've got a whole group of people, because prisons were pretty porous in that time. And this was advertising, and Amsterdam was seen as having a really, really good prison system as compared to others. Now, flogging was something the English Empire had a great appetite for. Singapore still does it in 2015, held to be constitutional. And the UK did it for a long time, and Arkansas did it in the 1960s, and 3 federal judges said it was okay until 1968, when Judge Harry Blackmun said, "I'm sorry, you can't whip anymore." But here we are now at Statesville in 1925, and this is just a fast way forward from the 1700s to the 20th century. And what I'm hoping, in addition to seeing the horror of this terrible, noisy, light-filled caging, is to also see the enormous infrastructure. And we today say the word corrections as if that were comprehensible, with perhaps not appreciating the political energy that it took to generate a discrete profession. There were the people once involved in prisons in the 17 and 1800s were philanthropists, charity, and social scientists. And then in the 19th and 20th century, through the National Prison Association in the United States and the International Penal Penitentiary Commission in Europe and the United States, a global organization global imperial organization from 1872 to 1951, all of this enterprise developed a persona of someone called corrections. And I was just listening to a court hearing about COVID in Danbury. And in the context of that, there was a description of how the Federal Bureau of Prisons is the expert on knowing about safety. And this idea that they gather expertise comes from their own enormous enterprise of developing, and supported by corrections, penology, criminology, law professors, non-law professors, and a vast enterprise, this idea that there's a special expertise in securing the world by creating institutions like this. And just to be sure so this is an aerial view from 2011 of a large detention center in San Bernardino. And so there's nothing, I've shown you some antique pictures, but I'm also trying to show you the utter continuity between the antique and the now in these kinds of containment facilities. Now, what I've just done is also describe up until after World War II. The prisoners were the objects of control and the objects of surveillance and the objects of concern. And a whole bunch of people actually really wanted to make it less awful. But in addition, they had very little juridical or social recognition as individuals with voice and authority. And so up until after World War II, and the prisoners worked through publicity, through sit-down strikes, through riots, there's terrible descriptions of people cutting their own Achilles heels, through all sorts of ways to try to get people to see what was happening to them. But law was not much available, although a bunch of them banged at courthouse doors for a long time. And this is an example of the hundreds of individual non-represented people who filed individual petitions in federal courts around the country in the 60s and 70s. I mentioned that Judge Blackmun found whipping unconstitutional. It's because a man named Talley brought a pro se complaint saying, "Stop the whip." I'm here in Alabama to just show you, in my little bit that's left, I wanted to bring to the fore the words of people who were in detention. And what was remarkable in the 60s and 70s is that when law was telling them that they were non-human beings for purposes of the U.S. Constitution and could cite the 14th and 13th Amendment in some way for some of these propositions, these people said, no, you've got it wrong. We are people for purposes of the U.S. Constitution, and eventually persuaded lawyers and judges that they were right. So like Nelson Mandela, who is sitting there saying, I'm not a rights holder, but I am a rights holder. These are people, we don't know their names as well, but Jerry Lee Pugh is one of them. And he and a couple of these other people need to be in the same story with Beccaria and Bentham, because they're all theorizing punishment. And these guys' theories of punishment is that there's a limitation on what the state can do to them as human beings. And that limitation is a new theory of punishment. Because before then, there were a lot of theories of why the state could or should do, but not that the state couldn't do. And that's what this is about. So Jerry Lee Pugh is sitting in Alabama in a horrific setting. And here, Jerry Lee Pugh tells you that he is white, that he had told the prison people that he was in a facility with many blacks. They failed to keep him safe, and he was beaten. And he files a pro se complaint with these claims. And these are his typed allegations of what happened to him. This comes into the Honorable Frank Johnson, great judge in Alabama's district court, along with, this is the request for relief. And so it's wonderfully written. And this is a handwritten. Worley James brings a case against George Wallace, whose name you may know as the horrific governor of the state of Alabama at the time. And he says that he's a black prisoner who is in terrible health care, and there are terrible conditions. And he has this filed, it's on yellow paper. This is the best I can do with these are from the National Archives. And he signs it. And then he says, this last page is where my last minutes will be spent. This is what he calls a memorandum of law. It doesn't look like a memorandum you and I write. If for those of us who are lawyers in this conversation, it is a brilliant memorandum of law, because he cites 13 cases from around the country. And those 13 cases are all cases that say that a prisoner can bring a claim and a prisoner has the potential for succeeding. And on my roll call here, just for the moment, the first one, these are small, I've put them in chronological order. He didn't have them that way. Calif, Washington, it's called Washington v. Lee, a wonderfully named case, not by happenstance. These are black and white prisoners in Alabama saying that the segregation by race by statute is unconstitutional, and Frank Johnson will hold it unconstitutional. And the first class action Supreme Court case on conditions is Lee v. Washington, upholding in a per curiam. So Calif, Washington comes first. Second, Robert Gilmore in San Quentin is bringing a First Amendment claim that he doesn't have access to legal materials. Then it's Lawrence Holt in Arkansas. Arkansas will be the first in the country in 1970 to hold hold unconstitutional the entire prison system as a dark and evil place. Filed pro se as well. Billy Sinclair is famous for many people in Louisiana as one of the many oppressed by Angola, describing the water that he's given, which has rust in it, in disgusting solitary. Robert Landsman in Virginia is describing his solitary conditions and gets Judge Merridge to go on for pages in nauseating detail of how Virginia is treating him. Francis Haynes, as in Haynes v. Kerner, is telling us in Illinois that he's been assaulted. Fred Cruz in Texas is a Buddhist who can't practice his religion. Johnny Williams in Florida is in horrible conditions. Johnny Bowman and has health care in Alabama. And Frank Danson in Florida is in terrible conditions. And the case suite ends with Newman, which is an Alabama case about healthcare in Alabama back in there. So what we're looking at is a sweep of the United States. This is by no means a story at all of any one part of the United States. It is a story about degradation that was normalized through the corrections profession over centuries and then undone to some extent when the words prisoners' rights and dignities came to be ensconced both in conventions of human rights around the world and in the United States law to some extent. But this is a homage to the people who were ahead of everybody else in understanding the importance of the relationship of law to them. And it's also a deep cry of pain because now I end with the pictures that Justice Kennedy attached to his decision in Brown v. Plata. And here what you're seeing, of course, is the California 2011 prison system with disgusting overcrowding and caging of people as they are allegedly mentally ill and waiting in theory for something that somebody would call health care responses. So one of the major questions for those of us who sit inside law is law has a relationship to this. And I also want to be clear that when you read some of the descriptions of strip cells, dark cells, flogging and whipping, rats and vermin, it's not that there's no rats and vermin, but there's at least a stated obligation that there shouldn't be rats and vermin. I should underscore that California in an amazing case by Robert Fitzgerald said, we don't have any obligation in the 60s. The US Constitution has nothing to say to us, nothing, flat. So if we think about nothing to say to us, and we think here we have to appreciate all the work that has moved to some form of relationship. But of course, the terrible problem is, look at this. How is it that the Rights Project has not done more? And of course, one answer is a failure of law that we hope will be redeemed. So as I close, the Marshall Project reported this morning that there were 329,000 prisoners who had contracted COVID with a up 5% positive rate, that more than 2,000 had died, that 84,000 staff members had been contracted, and 140 had died. Of course, as you'll hear from all of the other speakers, these are just bits of numbers that are not accurate, but this is one way to think about, here it is 2021, I started us in the 1700s on purpose to ask how, in much shorter time, the kinds of things we think of as normal would become to be seen as exotic as branding and transportation, and seeing that this form of totalizing control is just peculiarly, completely inappropriate, as when you read in the 20s and 30s about food deprivations and bread and water and strip cells and dark cells and all this stuff. And we might say, oh no, well, it's time to say absolutely not. So that's my way of introducing some of what we'll be talking about today. And I am delighted. The idea of sort of the sequence will be that Andrea Armstrong, who's in Louisiana, will go next with a remarkable, I've already seen a little preview of a very powerful conversation. Sharon Dolovich from California will continue from UCLA, and Dwayne Betts back here in Connecticut will be the last speaker. And we're hoping to have time for exchange, so that I'm turning the floor, Andrea, over to you, and I will stop sharing my screen, I hope successfully. There.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is wonderful to be a part of this panel. I am honored to have been invited to speak by my former professor, Professor Resnick, as well as to share this space with two additional people who inspire me in multitudes of ways to do this work, Sharon Dolovich and Dwayne Betts. So my research and my teaching and advocacy are around conditions. And though I've published different pieces of work, there's a common theme in all of them. And that is kind of excavating, exploring, uncovering what these spaces are inside, towards thinking about what does that mean for us as a society? How do we punish, and what do we consider to be appropriate punishment? And so I've done that in lots of different ways, writing about prison labor, and then looking at Angola to think about slavery, and looking at that historical project, looking at comparisons between prison law and, say, school law. And I've also been using other projects, working with architects, historians, documentarians on two particular projects here in Louisiana. One, looking at the House of Detention, which was a primary part of the New Orleans jail until it was closed in 2014. And then the other looking at Camp J at Angola. And so what I wanted to do today is to really, cleave to the section that we're in, Law and Humanities, And I wanted us to think about what do the humanities bring to some of this work, and exploring some of the projects I've worked in to kind of highlight that idea and that theme. And so the place where I want to start off is that prisons are secret closed spaces. And they are that way intentionally. They are that way through law. Law has repeatedly, in cases from every single angle, from every different level, closed off our spaces of detention, whether it's a prison, whether it's a jail, whether it's a youth detention center, whether it's a federal detention center, has closed them off to public view. And yet, those are our government institutions. Those are the institutions, much like our schools, that we as taxpayers and as rights holders, we pay for the conditions, and those are our responsibility as well. And so through, I'm not going to go through extensively the law because we're all lawyers, and the point of this is to really talk about the humanities part of it. But what you see here is a second floor disciplinary cell. And these are, even once you're in the building from the house of detention, these are hidden off of on the second floor, where the main cells are floors 4 through 10, right? Second floor was administrative. It's where the kitchen is. And then you have these tucked down in a hallway. And so for me, it really speaks to this idea of what secrecy is and what secrecy looks like. And so, I want us to think about not only, how do conditions tell us about where we have been, but also where we may go. And so the first part of this presentation focuses just on the House of Detention, New Orleans. This is more of a documentary project with historians, but also with people who have actually spent time there to kind of understand what the House of Detention really meant for generations of people in New Orleans. Every jail is different, and I don't presume to say that these buildings speak to all experiences, and it's also impossible to capture what it is to be incarcerated, and I have never been incarcerated. What I can tell you is that every facility I go to, and I've been to dozens across the country now, they're different, but they are all encompassing. The sounds, the smells, some are horribly loud. Some of them are quiet as a tomb. The different smells that you encounter, it is a singular experience, and one that the facilities I visited, I'm not sure any human being deserves any of the treatment that I have seen in all of these visits. So what I want to do is at least visually convey, and I just want to kind of warn people who may be a little bit more sensitive. None of these pictures here are quote unquote violence, but they are all violent in the ways that people experience them. So the House of Detention. The House of Detention is a 10-story building. New Orleans used to have a sprawling jail of upwards of 7,500 people with 11 different buildings at any given point. This was a primary part of it. It had 900 people. It also included our psychiatric wing, protective custody, as well as other facilities. In 2014, it was closed. And one of the primary reasons that it was closed was because of the security concerns. And so if you have spare time, please feel free to Google New Orleans jail escape videos. You can also see people inside using contraband cell phones, gambling, drinking beer, doing drugs through a fire escape where people could get in and out. And so the question of whether jails make us safer, I think, is a really relevant question, considering that for at least some time in the population, they could just come and go as they pleased. So, New Orleans has a very long history of consent decrees. And, up and through and this period, as well as a new consent decree that we're under now. And so the spaces that you're going to see are the spaces that were, in fact, regulated by law. And so the next space that I want to show you, and this was a day room that you would actually also see in the videos if you so Googled. So this next picture is of the attorney-client visitation room at HOD. There were only 3 of them for the entire 900 population, which meant public defenders had to make appointments and would wait, a huge amount of time in order to see their clients. But it also really exposes for me the difficulty of confidential communications with your client, because there's no way to pass through documents. You couldn't hold something up to the glass so that somebody could read it. You can, in fact, when you're in the space, you can barely make out the facial expressions of the person who is across from you. This is the outdoor recreation at the House of Detention. This is the only outdoor space that was available for an average of a daily average of about 900 people. At one point, the staffing ratios were 1 to 75 in this building, which was rife with violence and harm to everyone who had to spend time in that building. And so often when we hear about folks not being allowed outside time, it is in part because of the spaces in which we give them. This is the 10th floor of the House of Detention. It was the psychiatric unit. And from this position, you are standing basically at the entrance to the tier. So what I want you to think about is, to what extent can you see what's happening down on the last cell, right? And in fact, there's no visibility on this tier at all. We had one of the highest per capita death rates in the New Orleans jail for deaths in custody, particularly for suicides. And this entire tier was used to hold those who were in mental distress. This is a restraint cell, which is at the front of the psychiatric tier. And, when I think about incarceration beyond law, I also think about it as involuntary housing and continuing violence, because this is a space where people would be strapped down, ankles, hands, sometimes head points. There was no restroom facility in this cell, and nearby, what's not pictured is a rolling, at best it can be described as a rolling pot, which I guess they must have let folks use at some point or another. But there are accounts, not only historically, but in modern times, of people being restrained to this bed for hours and, in fact, days at times. This is the medical room as it existed. And this was the sole room for treatment in the New Orleans jail. And this picture, it actually represents significant progress under the law. This is what the law could achieve. So the House of Detention, in fact, did not perform intake health screenings at the jail until the mid-1990s. Which meant rampant kind of infectious disease outbreaks in the jail. And then as people went home, they would bring those back to their home and their communities. This was also the dental unit for a part-time dentist. And, we can imagine that it wasn't until recently that dental care was in fact offered. And then once they did begin to offer it in the mid-1970s, it consisted solely of tooth extractions. And so there are generations of people in New Orleans who lack teeth, which my family has always called doing OPP time, right? The Orleans Parish Prison time. So even though HOD, that project is not about dreaming, it really does help us to understand this is a building that closed 6 years ago. And so it is not the distant past, although it has existed for quite some time. Is something that generations of people have experienced and continue to feel the repercussions from. Next, I wanted to move to the second project, which is the closure of Camp J at Louisiana State Penitentiary, which is our maximum security state prison. Located on 18,000 acres. And you'll see there that the Prison View Golf Course is temporarily closed. That's a whole nother story. But let's just say that the folks there do not get to golf. That's not for them. All right, so Camp J. So Camp J was the horrendous solitary confinement and disciplinary unit. So Angola is composed of multiple camps, like multiple buildings within this 18,000 foot structure, square foot, 18,000 acre former plantation. And so Camp J is just one small building within this larger complex. And it was closed in 2018 in May, in part because of security risks. Guards would talk about the ways in which people could stick bubble gum to the inside of their closing door in order to defeat the locking mechanisms. And there, what you see is how complex it was to actually lock a cell door. These were the instructions that were posted in Camp J to remind custodial staff that they had to go through all 7 steps in order to ensure that somebody would remain in their cell at the time. This project was actually part of a reimagining project, which was led by Vera and included teams of architects, designers, people who were currently in custody, people who had been in custody, as well as staff, medical and custody staff. And like New Orleans, Angola has been subject to consent decrees for a very long time. And so this is what law could achieve. So this is the visitation area in Camp J, which, does 2 things within this scope. One is it demonstrates that so many of our incarcerated people are actually parents, and they are continuing parents. And the fact that we have high chairs stashed away for visitation in a maximum security facility says something. They were only then that chair is wheeled up to a glass structure because Camp J did not have contact visits. But what it does do as well is it helps us understand in focus groups with people who are incarcerated, with staff, with people who had spent time there, as well as who were there currently. It also reminds us that these are spaces that can be spaces of togetherness, right? And so when we design future punitive spaces, because we are in many ways based out of a format of punishment more than anything else when we think about crimes, that those spaces have to embody a way for people to be together. This is the outdoor rec at Camp J, and Glenn Ford, who spent 29 years on death row, who was a friend of mine, and I am now the executrix of his estate, wrongly convicted, spent some time in Camp J. And for the last 7 years before he was released in 2014, he never went outside because he said he refused to be treated like an animal, and that the cages that they had for them to go outside, he called them a dog pen. But if you take these cages away, what people saw in our conversations were they saw a college quad. They saw a green space that was bounded by buildings. And so, just looking at this space and the sun and the green and the blue sky and the idea that these spaces do not have to be as punitive as they are, and that there are in fact other ways of thinking about how we deal with this. This is the solitary tier in Camp J. And again, this was relatively right after closure. And flooding and electrical problems are a huge reason why these buildings were closed. But when people were there and in the space, they said, listen, this is a large, wide hallway. And we can remake this space into a place to care for our elders. Angola has one of the oldest populations in the United States. 2/3 of the people there are doing either life or the equivalent of life with terms. And so thinking about if these people can't go home, can we give them dignity? Or at least can we recognize their dignity, I think better said, by removing the bars and utilizing the open hallways and spaces. This is in a solitary cell, and on the side of the walls, what you'll see there is growing mold. And mold is a constant feature throughout Camp J. And one of the responses, several of the responses and discussions around Camp J and what it could be and dreaming out loud also involved razing this place to the ground. And for some, that was the only way that we could address the history of suffering in Camp J is to simply demolish it. This is a picture of the building layout for Camp J, and architecturally thinking about it, people looked at these separate wings and they looked at that common front entry space where the guard space is, and they envisioned it as a lobby, which could then spark off into recording studios that each tier could then, because of its separateness and its solid wall structure, could be converted into practice rooms and recording rooms for the people who are still forced to remain at Angola. So this is one of the last picture slides. There's a few more, but this is actually 3 pictures. On the far left is Red Hat, which was which still stands at Angola, although it is permanently closed. I do believe it was closed in 1972. It was a place of beatings, whippings en masse. Many of the things that Professor Resnick talked with us about occurred here at Red Hat up until 1972. And it was a solitary space. The middle picture is a picture of a cell in Camp J. It has a double bunk, but it was only used as a single bunk. And that was closed in 2018. I see you. Thank you. And then in 2000, and then to the far right is a current cell in the closed cell restriction that is still open and being used to this day. So what I hope these pictures have helped you see is that the humanities help us see what law does not merit, what law thinks doesn't merit consideration. Here you see holes in the wall above a cell door where people would carve holes to put their toothbrushes because they had nowhere else to put their toothbrush. And the law doesn't recognize a claim of action for not having a sanitary place to put your toothbrush. And yet it is meaningful and it is degrading. The same with the masking tape for court transports. And so ultimately, this project is attempting to document the historical and continuing impact of incarceration and to pave a new path forward. My last point is to say that just because these buildings were closed does not mean that they will no longer house suffering. At the top is a pile of jumpsuits, which are waiting to be filled by bodies, primarily Black and brown bodies. At the bottom is the underside of a bunk, the counting of days. After the closure of Camp J, it was reopened in the time of COVID and was used to house people from across the state who were held in jails or other prisons as they tested positive for COVID or were exposed. And so the closure of these buildings is not the end of the suffering, but is often just a chance for repurposed use. So with that, I'd like to thank you for any thoughts or comments you have or questions, and please feel free to contact me. I would love to talk about your work as well as share some more about this project.
Thank you, to catch my breath. Sharon Dolovich, UCLA, COVID and more. Go for it. You're mute.
Let me fix that. So can you hear me now? Yes? Okay, so let me just start by thanking Judith for bringing us together, for inviting me to participate, thanking her and Andrea for those really powerful presentations, and thanking Dwayne in advance because I'm really eager to hear what you have to say. So this is, in a way, a panel about imagining the prison, as Andrea suggests, and I've been thinking a lot lately about the way the public typically conceives of prisons and of the place that prisons and the people who live in them hold in the public imagination. So, you know, as both Judith and Andrea's pictures make very clear, prisons are places of exclusion. When we send people to prison, we are sending them out and away, right out of our sight, away from society. So for most people whose lives have not intersected at all with the carceral system, it is possible to imagine that the people that we sentence to prison just disappear. But of course, we know they don't just disappear. They relocate to institutions that are very much still embedded in society, however much we try to place those facilities in places where they will be hidden away. And people who study prisons, you know, have long emphasized this point, the many, many ways that incarceration intersects with the broader society. When I teach my prison law class, we start by creating a list of all the different constituencies that are impacted by incarceration beyond just the people that we imprison. And when we're done, the board is always covered. So we know this, and still prisons are often imagined to occupy a space beyond and outside society's borders. Now, it may be that finally COVID has brought home to American society the essential embeddedness of the prison, and that remains to be seen. But those of us who study prisons are always engaged in challenging this assumption. We're trying to basically expose the many points of interconnection. In a way, when you study prisons, whatever the angle, and you could study prisons from pretty much any angle, that's the essence of the work, to challenge the illusion, or maybe more accurately put, the delusion that what happens in prison and to the people that we incarcerate somehow occurs beyond and apart from society. So I'm one of those people who has made challenging this notion my life's work. For me specifically, the aim has been to focus attention on the responsibility that we all bear for the character of prison conditions and the way people are treated in custody. Up until about 10 months ago, the tools that I used to do this work were moral and political theory, policy critique, legal analysis, and then came COVID. And starting about mid-March of last year, 2020, I got drawn into thinking about the same set of themes, right? Prison conditions, our obligations to the people we incarcerate, the interconnection between what happens in prison and what happens in society more generally. I got drawn into thinking about these themes from a very different perspective, not from the perspective of moral theory or constitutional law, but from the perspective of basic data. And in a little bit, I'll share with you some visuals representing what I and my colleagues in this work have found over 10 months of tracking the spread of COVID in prisons and jails around the country. But first, I want to say a little about the landscape that we have confronted as we have sought to do this work, in this sort of the spirit of imagining or understanding the prison in new ways. So if we think about the effort to make sense of the impact of COVID in prison in terms of a map, there are some things that we can confidently locate on the map, right? The boundaries are clear. We know where the institutions are situated. We can trace the general dynamics of inflow and outflow into and out of facilities. We can identify the forces that create the spread of COVID and identify the features that might accelerate or arrest the spread. And thanks to departments of corrections that are posting basic data, we can also map official accounts of the extent of viral proliferation in virtually all prisons and most of the big jails. And in fact, we're doing that mapping work now. I will show you shortly. But there are also large swaths of territory on this map of COVID in prison that remain blank, that are uncharted, and that need filling in. And that's what we, at the data project that I'll tell you about, that's what we're trying to do. Now, in some cases, the empty spaces that we're trying to fill consist of what Donald Rumsfeld famously called known unknowns, right? We know the kind of data we want. We know the sorts of effects that are manifesting, and we just need somehow to get at the specifics of what is actually happening. So infection rates and COVID deaths fall into this category, right? We know people are being infected likely at much larger rates than are being officially reported. We know people are dying of COVID or because of the constraints that COVID has placed on carceral life, again, likely at higher rates than are being reported. But because this information is so tightly held by jail and prison administrators, the true numbers remain unknowns. So these data are among the known unknowns that we're trying to chase down. And of course, as Rumsfeld's epistemology suggests, there are also, without a doubt, innumerable unknown unknowns, which only dedicated investigation will reveal. Now, by definition, I can't give you examples of unknown unknowns because, they're unknown. But I can point to measures of the impact of COVID in custody, which of course will also represent the impact of COVID in society. I can point to measures that began as unknown unknowns and have only recently come into view as phenomena requiring exploration. So one category that has recently shifted from the status of unknown unknown to known unknown is the number of suicides among people incarcerated during the pandemic. So over the last few months, it's become evident, I guess predictably, that months of lockdown and fear inside have taken their toll and that suicide rates have increased in custody since the start of COVID. Now, the question, of course, is by how much? It's probably too soon to know. Another more recently emergent known unknown is the rate of increase of drug overdose deaths in prisons since last March. This is only also just starting to clarify as another damaging effect of COVID in custody. So what we've been trying to do is map this emerging landscape of COVID in prison in real time as the pandemic unfolds. The strategy is to target and map the dimensions of the known unknowns. And of course, over the course of the work, as we do this work, this category keeps growing. And so also the map of the landscape we're creating keeps growing. Okay, so let me just turn to talk a little bit about what we've been doing since the start of the pandemic at what we're calling the UCLA Law COVID-19 Behind Bars Data Project. Also tell you a little about how we've been doing it and to fill in the picture by identifying the pieces that we are actively mapping. So this effort began really by accident in the middle of March of last year when COVID first emerged as a global threat, and it quickly became obvious that people in prisons and jails would become among the hardest hit. So this data project really just began as a 2-tab open source spreadsheet. One of the tabs was so that prisoners' rights advocates could post and share the complaints and demand letters they were quickly pulling together on behalf of their incarcerated clients. And the other tab was to share information about canceling of visits in prison systems across the country, which had begun in a kind of national cascade in the middle of March. So we just started with these 2 tabs and invited people to post their data, and it just grew from there. And now, thanks to, we had some generous funders, we have more than 140 volunteers who have worked with us. We've gone from that modest beginning to a multi-tab spreadsheet tracking many different aspects of the pandemic's effects on people in custody. And I want to acknowledge at some point early in this effort, I was joined in this work by my UCLA colleague, Erin Littman, who became deputy director of the project. So our staff actually over the last 10 months has grown steadily, again, thanks to some generous funders. So we now employ 9 people, 4 data scientists, an investigator, a policy analyst, a staff writer, a stakeholder relations manager, and a part-time project coordinator. The main data we've all been gathering and posting is quantitative. So over time, our team has developed a system for tracking and posting facility level data as officially reported by corrections agencies around the country. And this tracking effort now covers more than 1,600 individual facilities, almost every prison and some of the biggest jails around the country. And just to be clear, again, these are the numbers that are reported by corrections departments. So there's data on COVID infections and deaths of residents, also often of staff in each institution, as well as depending on the dashboard, there might be number of tests conducted, people recovered, number in quarantine, and so on. We're doing something similar with immigration detention centers and youth facilities. We also track and post data relating to jail and prison releases due to COVID, judicial filings and court orders, dealing with COVID in custody. And also we're tracking grassroots organizing, both inside and outside carceral facilities, and this is just among other things. And having a full-time staff has really allowed us to expand our work, including beyond the data that we post on our spreadsheet. So we have an ambitious public records operation. We're requesting and receiving an enormous amount of data from the BOP and from state and local corrections agencies, which we are just beginning to make usable and shareable, and which we think will help us answer questions about COVID that the basic data leaves open. Our coding of court orders has actually shifted to become an exciting collaboration under the heading of Health is Justice, spearheaded really by Susan Sturm at Columbia Law School. So we're working with Columbia and Bronx Defenders and the Zealous Institute. And the aim here, our collective aim, is to create a comprehensive searchable database of all of the judicial decisions bearing on COVID in custody. We're working with the folks at Families Against Mandatory Minimums, on a project on compassionate release during COVID. We have students beginning to analyze the judicial opinions relating especially to class action challenges to conditions and seeking release from custody due to COVID. We have a team of 20 volunteers who have been capturing and coding all of the COVID-related policies announced by all of the departments of corrections nationwide since last March. And the goal here is to have a comprehensive searchable database of those policies. We've recently begun working on the issue of vaccine prioritization. We're beginning an oral history project focusing on prisoners' rights lawyers representing people during COVID. So these are just some of our initiatives. There are actually too many to list here. One of the things I've discovered doing this work is that when you build a structure and have a clear mission, it actually becomes possible to rapidly expand the work exponentially. The only limitation is human bandwidth, although it turns out that when the mission is urgent and the structure is accessible, it becomes easy to bring people in. At least we found that, although I guess we have been helped by the fact that during the pandemic, many students and others have been seeking a way to do something meaningful, and they found their way to us. So in the few minutes I have left, I just want to briefly show you 3 things. Our spreadsheet, our interactive website, which just launched a few weeks ago, and our org chart. So this is a panel about imagining the prison, which, as I've suggested, is in part a project of mapping. And each of the 3 visual representations that I'm going to briefly show you provides a different kind of spatial picture of what we are doing and trying to do. And because this is a conference of law professors, I just want to emphasize that what I've done here, any one of us could do. Right now, I have spent a lot of time studying prisons, but I'm primarily a theorist. I have no quantitative experience, no quantitative data experience. I've never managed a staff. Half the time, when our data scientists are talking about the work we're doing, I don't understand a word. And still, together, we are building a data set that will inform efforts to understand the impact of COVID in custody, which is one aspect of the pandemic that I'm certain people will be studying for decades to come. So I want to just now briefly share my screen and start with, I'm going to start with, if I can, hang on, let me just, sorry, here we go. So this is, I'll start with our table of contents. So this is our spreadsheet. We've been working with the spreadsheet for a year, and we have on the table of contents all of the things that we're tracking. So confirmed cases and deaths, jail and prison releases. These are the initial two tabs that we posted: reduction requests and population reduction responses. This is the initial court order filings that has some of our data and then links to health is justice, immigration filings, youth filings, immigration detention facilities tracking, correctional facilities. Here's our visitation policy closed data set if anybody's interested in getting that data. We started tracking policies at the beginning, but there were too many. We had to stop that. But we're still tracking fundraisers and mutual aid efforts in the hopes that people who come to the site will want to help, and then our grassroots tab. And then we have a database of additional resources. And then at the bottom, we just have all of the data that can be accessed by tabs. And the one that I'll show you is our main data sheet. So this is our, we have all the facilities listed. We have our current tracker of confirmed cases, residents and staff, and deaths, residents and staff. And I'll just show you, just to give you a feel, it just goes on and on and on. These are over 1,600 prisons around the country. And I'll put in a minute, I'll put in the chat the link to the spreadsheet for people who are interested. So that's the first just visual I wanted to show you. The second one quickly I wanted to show you is our, wait a minute, sorry, I have to get to the other screen, is our new interactive website. So in terms of mapping, we have a visual map. So this is the homepage of our site. It's just still a work in progress. But I wanted to show you what we've done is we've posted the data for state and federal facilities and county jails. These are the reported numbers of cumulative cases in each facility. So you can sort of see it's a map, in part a map of where the facilities are. So for example, there are many bigger facilities in California, many smaller facilities in Texas. Some of the blanks is just that we have, as you know, limited population in the country, so fewer facilities, but also you can sort of see where testing is happening. We know that facilities have been slow to bring their testing online. And so as facilities are tested, that's when we start to see them show up on our map. And I'll just show you that you can click on each state and it gives you case rates and cumulative cases listed by facility. There's links to and some data about court orders and releases. And again, so what we're trying to do is link every aspect of our data so that you can see it when you click on each state. And very quickly, the last thing I will show you, just to give you, this is sort of mapping our effort, our own enterprise, so you can see the proliferation. And this is our org chart, and this is just as of end of November. And it just started with me and Aaron, and we had the green boxes, or we had volunteers from around the country who offered to spearhead each of those tabs. And then we had our yellow boxes are staff, and the blue box, the purple boxes are students who are working with us for credit, and the blue boxes are volunteers, many from UCLA, many from around the country, who have reached out to us and said, "Can we help?" And we have so much work and so many projects, and we are just slotting people in. So I show you this as a kind of a local map of proliferation in terms of commitment to this work, and also just to invite you to share with any of your students, colleagues, anyone who you think might want to work with us. We would love to have you. So with that, I will stop.
Thank you. An impressive and daunting project. There's too much. The bad part is there's so much to map. Dwayne Betts, who is currently a PhD candidate at Yale and in English, and additionally was a Lyman Fellow and is working with Mellon on putting 1 million books into prison, and is a poet, is the next speaker. He will also have about 15 minutes, which I think gives us a little bit of time for interaction. I believe there are ways you can put into chats things that we will be able to see, to respond to, and in another world, we'd all be on a Zoom meeting where we could talk directly to each other, but in this world, we'll do that medium. So Dwayne, you're up next.
Cool. So I'll just tell a story and then talk a little bit about some stuff. So I was at a prison once that when I was in solitary the first time for I think the third time actually, but for like a 6-month stretch, when we went out to rec, they put us in those dog kennels, and I remember that. But anyway, I came home, and the backstory is just 2 minutes, but I came home, got a bunch of degrees, thought I would be able to get a job, couldn't get a job for various reasons, mainly because I had a felony, and had to decide what to do next. And I figured I would go to law school, because what is the best occupation for somebody with 3 felonies? To become a lawyer. And so I go to law school, and I'm in my first class. And what is so wild about the class is that it was one of those moments where I felt like the professor was talking to me. It was a legal research and writing course, and I learned to do legal research with books. Like, when I learned how to shepherdize in law school, I was sort of lost because I was looking for the books, and I couldn't understand why they were telling me that I just had to go to this website. I couldn't function. I learned how to read cases and do research in much the same way that the people in the cases that Judith talked about was doing research. And that's why I find it like deeply impressive, because it literally was like finding a needle in a haystack, finding cases in states that's reported in several different books. It was a different world. And so my point is, I feel really equipped to do well in legal research and writing. And the professor said, he said, law school is where poets go. And I knew I was the only poet accepted to Yale Law School. And so I paused, and I made his speaking like pause in my head. And I thought he was about to say, law school is where poets go to become senators. And then I thought, Yale is fancy and judges is the people who get the rap. So I thought law school is the place where poets go to become Supreme Court justices. And then because Obama was the president, I honestly thought he might say law school is the place where poets go to become president. And I was like really excited about what I was about to become. And then my man said, law school is the place where poets go to die. And it hit me that as a profession and as a world, it was coming down from everybody. It was this tacit understanding that law school was meant to strip all the beauty and the rigor and the deep complexity that allowed me to survive prison. And so I spent my whole time in law school figuring out how to resist against this. I organized magic shows for the families of law students and the families of the staff and the faculty members. I won a poetry contest. My 1L Con law professor did a poetry contest where I was able to flex my skills and win the Bill Wharton Award. And I did other things, right? But it all came to a head when I started working with Alec Karakastanis from the Civil Rights Corps. Was telling me about his cases. I was kind of collaborating with him a little bit, thinking about how to bring more literature into the idea of legal work and legal advocacy. And he gave me these cases he was working on, right? And it's a class action lawsuit. And it was quite fascinating because it was this notion that you could sue a city. And I sort of understood it. But a lot of times in law school, the context of cases gets stripped from the discussion of holdings, gets stripped from the discussion of, statutory elements that rule the day. But when you read these, and it's like, 80 pages, but when you read it and you get down to the nitty gritty, it's saying that the state incarcerated somebody because they owed traffic tickets, because they couldn't pay small amounts of bail. And I thought it was completely fascinating until I started checking out other words in here, like numerosity, like jurisdiction. And I started telling myself how great this was. And I was trying to explain it to my cousin, and he was like, don't get it. And I was like, but if you just read it. And I'm shaking it at him, And he's like, I'm not reading that shit. It's like 80 pages and it's filled with jargon. And so I thought, I'm a poet. If I could turn this into a poem, I have actually accomplished something. And and so that's what I did. I started redacting things, and I started getting rid of everything that I thought was superfluous, scraping words away. And I did that until I was left with this. And I won't read it, but I'm gonna show you. Not that. So I was left with this. I'll just read the first page, right? The plaintiffs, impoverished, jailed by the city, unable to pay traffic tickets, pay or sit in jail, $50 per day, plaintiffs unable to pay, each sent to jail, told they could work off debts, $25 per day, clean in the city, scrubbing feces and blood from jail floors. The treatment reveals the city against its poorest, jailing people if they poor. Plaintiffs seek fundamental rights they suffered. The city is unlawful. It is the policy of the city to jail people. It is the policy of the city to jail people. It is the policy of the city to hold prisoners until extinguished. It is the policy. It is the policy. Plaintiffs seek relief. And I wasn't gonna read the whole thing, but I decided this is a law conference. Let's read some poetry. But it's wild though, right? Because I did it, and I was working with the artist Titus Gafar, and we wanted to do something more with it, right? And we wanted to create a series of prints that also allowed. We was having this conversation about how does the language of literature communicate with the language of visual art. And so we created these prints, and Titus had long been thinking about the ways in which the mugshot, which is in many ways a kind of perfect way to pose. The pose used in the mugshot is a kind of perfect way to reveal a person's face, right? But what happens is the mugshot has been turned into a way to stigmatize folks. And for many people, prior, the digital era, for many people, that mugshot became their only footprint in a world of like the visual representation of who they are. And so, Titus, we wanted to turn that frame into something that had more beauty. And so the last frame I showed was one of the prints, and that's what's here back on my wall. It's two of the prints. We created a series of 50 prints. We had an exhibit at MoMA PS1, and it was great. And we had the poems all across the wall. And what we thought it was really was the opportunity for people who were the members of that class action lawsuit to speak for themselves through the text in the case stripped of all of the legalese, and also through these beautiful images that Titus had produced. But the thing was, I wanted to invest the work with more of the substance of the lives of people that I knew in prison, and also this enterprise of incarceration. And so I said, let's make some paper. Let me get some sheets. Let me get some clothes. And as easy as it is to get in prison and get a sentence, it was quite difficult to get a prison to just do something as simple as donate me brand new sheets, let me buy brand new sheets, donate me towels. It was nearly impossible. And so I found a workaround, and the workaround is in Virginia, like many states, they have, these services run by prisoners, these industries built on the backs of prisoners, and if you're a nonprofit, you could buy sheets, towels, like anything they make, you could buy it if you're a nonprofit. And so I got a nonprofit to buy some of these things for me. They bought towels. We had boxes and boxes of white towels, and we turned it into black paper, cut it up into little small pieces. Right, and you put it in a vat of water. And I worked with a printer artist in Brooklyn, and we turned it into paper. But I still feel like that was disconnected. And I was talking to the person who did the prints, and he was like, "Well, why don't you just use clothes or something?" So I had my guys send me their clothes. These dudes, doing like life in prison. This actually belonged to a friend that was doing life. And the thing is, like, you look at it, it got the holes in it. It got what happens from time. We don't even wear clothes like this no more. We dispose of things far before it becomes this ruined. But this material has a life and a substance in it that that is kind of what we bury in prison and what we try to ignore. And so they sent me the stuff and I cut it up into small pieces and I made paper and it became these gray sheets that you have here on the wall. Then what happened, and I'm coming to an end, is through the course of the project, I've been representing Juvie, my friend Christopher Tunstall, since I got locked up. I've been representing him since I was a second year law student, third year law student. I went to Virginia, argued for him in front of the parole board, lost case after case. And through the course of doing the redaction project, though, I helped another friend get a lawyer. And in fact, he ended up getting out. He ended up getting a conditional pardon from the Virginia governor. And then Juvie made parole, and Juvie came home. And then I represented this guy I knew. All of us were in the same prison together. So I got 3 people out who I used to live in the same housing unit with, who we used to do push-ups together, play basketball with. Juvie was the barber. He used to cut our hair. And I got them out. And then Juvie died. He died tragically. Came home in May, died in December. And I used to think, like, how the fuck can you die that quickly? And how is it possible to die that quickly and nobody understands why? And then I started working on the case of another friend who Luke asked me to help get out. And I'm representing him now, and I'll be in parole board for him next week. And the thing is, in 1999, he had the beginnings of what will become a tumor that was the size of 2 golf balls. And it didn't get discovered for 20 years, even though he went back to doctor time and time again. And when I had his medical records, more than 500 pages reviewed, the doctor said, I've never seen a tumor this big. And she was like, no, Dwayne, you don't get it. The reason why I've never seen a tumor this big is because any bootleg doctor would have discovered the presence of this tumor based on how many times he's come to see us. My point is that I was struggling to get these folks free, and I got some folks free, and I thought that the work was a testament of what it meant for them to be incarcerated. But how do you do something that's a testament for them struggling to be free? And they had written me letters, like dozens of letters. I had written them. I sent them money. They sent me photos. And I met a Japanese artist named Kyoko, and she took the black squares and the grayish sheets, and she turned them into what looks like kites, which you see hanging from my wall here. Got like a couple hundred of them now, but this is just like 16 hanging up. But she's a brilliant Japanese artist, and if you look at it, it's things floating in it. It's a Japanese paper making technique that allows you to put paper in water and then float other things into the paper that then combines and creates something new. And so she's made so far like a couple hundred of these. It's a little sort of painstaking process, but she's made a few hundred of these where she combines the paper. But what she's done is I just got a box of them right here. I just got a box of 100 from Japan. And what she's done is I mailed her a bunch of letters that my friends wrote me while they were in prison. And what she did was she took the letters and she floated it into the water with the paper. And so now the paper is embedded both with their cries for freedom, but with the congratulations that they gave me when I became a lawyer, with the congratulations they gave me when they won their freedom. And it's just sort of more evocative of their presence and their spirit. And I think, when I think about the whole project, the part of it is how do you allow somebody to speak for themselves, but also how do you start with legal text, start with a literal legal document and get to something that encompasses the whole life and potential and possibility that we try to bury inside prisons across this country. Thank you.
Thanks are due to you. And I'm struck in the multiple dimensions of the commentary about the layers, the extraordinary expanse of the punishment practices, the many, many modalities to capture how expansive, pervasive, deep, and engulfing these experiences of state power are. And the question, of course, to all of you to start with is the more of the unraveling or disentangling or the the lifting of some of the ways in which this expanse can, you talk about redactions, can we redact it in some important way? So I know there may be I think there's a way, I haven't utterly mastered it yet, to get comments from the public list. But in addition to that, I wanted to first start by going back to Sharon and Andrea and Dwayne to talk us forward some on how you would think about bursting the bubble of the prison and having it fall to the floor.
Yeah, I think two things. I'm not sure if we have the kind of defining artistic moment that really reveals what incarceration is. And the reason why I think that's important is because when I listen to people talk about mass incarceration, they talk about things that happened during their lifetime as if they actually didn't happen. You know, our contemporaries talk about the 90s as if the 90s weren't what they were. And it's a kind of flippant way in which we act as if like acknowledging mass incarceration as a real thing is somehow easy. And it's not. And so I think that we're just missing that work of art that really shatters our own refusal to look at quite uncomfortable truths. When you look at those the images that Andrea showed, I mean, those are like frightening. And they brought like chills to me. I was on the phone with somebody today explaining to me how he had done 40 years in prison. And he was explaining what it meant to get beat down by the guards from one housing unit to another housing unit 20 steps away. It is a way in which I think that we, and nearly every conversation I've been in around this with people who haven't been in prison, there is a way in which our intelligence gives us permission to act as if we really get it. And the only reason I know that that's true is because we don't have a Grapes of Wrath. We don't have a cultural, artistic marker of what this experience is that has risen to a national level that forces people to really confront, you know, what's going on every day. And I think it's more apparent even now during the time of COVID when people haven't been released to the degree that we can, even if we just stop locking people up for DUIs, you know, even if we started letting people go 2 years earlier. So I would say what we need to burst the bubble, and it's a challenge for artists, is to make this a topic for sustained and concentrated artistic work in such a way in which it like deeply reveals our historical failures and our contemporary failures.
Yeah, I will just add very briefly to that. I mean, I wrestle with this question just in the context of COVID because initially the first few months, there was so much public attention on what was happening in the prisons and the expectation of increased vulnerability of people inside, and a focus on the actual conditions of confinement that I had never seen, at least in the time that I had done this work. And there was so much focus that I thought that this could be the moment where kind of the general public, who again had imagined that this is somehow outside of their experience, was sort of forced to confront the actual experience of it. And of course, as we've seen over the last few months, it's just reconsolidated. And I think the fact that, you know, the data is held so close by the corrections administrators is because they don't want this reckoning to occur. And so it makes me even more certain that it's work like Dwayne's and the photos that Andrea is sharing with us and a forced reckoning with the reality that is the thing that will do it. And at this moment, I wish I had a magic, you know, the magic bullet. But I feel like at least I think Andrea and Dwayne have us on the right path.
Andrea, you want to comment some?
Sure. I mean, I do think that there's, I think of it like a balloon, right? And it is a pressure cooker in so many different ways. And that one of the things that I am lucky enough to do as a career is I can slowly poke holes into that balloon and slowly deflate it. And you know, when I was listening to Dwayne and talking about we haven't had that reckoning, I mean, I think that it, you know, we're all looking for that tool that's just going to rent a big rip through the skin of that balloon to let it all out at the same time. And I struggle in terms of theories of change and politics and how do we get to that point. But in the meantime, I do think that the small pinpricks that we make in lots of different ways, I think those are essential for the larger rip.
I wanted to interact with law a little bit in this and the normalization of it, because I'm a little, when I'm in the middle of writing this project around this, and in the context of it, I'm struck that it's so easy, and Dwayne, your 90s, it's so easy to look and read straightforward descriptions of bread and water and straightforward descriptions of the things that authorities countenanced as appropriate punishments, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And the part that surprises me is how bizarre prison is and how hard it is for people to see, how bizarre the radical micro control is. In Oregon, I visited a facility last year and learned that they have about 14,000 prisoners and they had 10,000 disciplinary hearings. And I kept thinking I had to have the numbers wrong. It had to be 41,000. I mean, I had to have those numbers wrong because you couldn't have 10,000 disciplinary hearings. So that was a piece of the question. And then I learned that actually that was just the tip of the iceberg, because you could bunk people and punish them for 72 hours in putting them in to their bunks. So they had many more disciplinary. And the idea that we haven't been able to make people think how radically weird it is to try, even in addition to the violence and the degradation, that the stunning control is just so weirdly out of appropriate human behavior. And so I hope that among all of us, we will, and many others, we will find ways to help people learn and see that this is just as bizarre as branding people. But I don't, and I guess the question is, though, is what is the thing that will help people see? Because there was a big revulsion in the 60s and 70s against some of the conditions that were found. People said, no, we shouldn't do that. And then Sharon says, and then there's a little bit here and a little bit there. And then the question is, how can it get accumulated? How can you do it? Andrea, I know you've been looking at the public, there's this public-private dimension. I think somebody said something about Norway. Do you want Andrea to help us summarize whatever comments have come in?
Sure. There's two mainly, and then I'm also aware that our moderator, our tech folks are telling us that time is up.
Okay. Summarize our comments, and then we'll have to move to the next activity.
Okay, so one of them is thinking about, looking at legal formalism and the role it plays in thinking about how do we kind of make this balloon either explode or rip or slowly leak out air. And so what they talk about is this bursting of the bubble two-tiered? The bubble of formal legalism and the bubble of a thin conceptualization of what prison is like in the popular imagination. And is it fair to say that the panel presents the potential of a broad notion of empiricism that encompasses subjective experiences? The second comment is thinking about the focus on conditions and to what extent conditions can be a distraction towards abolition. And so, one of the ending sentences was, the panel suggests how we need to burst the bubble and grapple with the experience and end the secrecy if we are ever to have this reckoning moment around abolition, and whether there are additional comments for that.
Well, I'm told that we're supposed to pull the plug. I do need to be sure to underscore that judges and law is part of the infrastructure that normalizes. So the decisions that say this is typical in prison and this is atypical in prison is saying that typical is licit, and that is a form, that is not just a form, that is a significant practice of sustaining it. And so we should not let law off any hook. It looked like it was coming on, and it has now been a prop as well as a potential balloon buster. I know that the section on law and humanities is having its business meeting immediately after this, and that Brian Sushik, chair-elect, has invited all the people who are at least our members. I think on behalf of myself, and I'm sure for the other chairs, all of us, welcome you to become members of all the sponsoring sections that have sponsored this, and also B, to join us in engagement through emails and otherwise in responding to the pain of the social order in which we live. And C, that we want to thank, because ALS has spent a lot of energy and time making it possible for us to be in this form of communication, and hope that there'll be many more iterations of this and many other forms of communication around the bend. So thank you to all of the participants, and Sharon and Andrea and Dwayne, and to continuing to find ways to be generative in a world that is demanding an undue amount from all of the people who are trying to lessen harm. And thank you.